right, it looks like we are now live on Facebook. We have some attendees who've joined us on Zoom in the webinar feature. So I think that means that our study of the book of Job for office hours, the second iteration of office hours, has begun. My name is Chris Holmes. I am the scholar in residence and director of biblical and theological education at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And I'm sure many of you watching this know me, but also want to provide the opportunity to introduce Brennan Breed, who is the partner in crime in this office hours endeavor, who teaches Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. And also we are joined this morning by Dr. Roy Yoder, who teaches Old Testament as well at Columbia Theological Seminary. And we'll hear more about Christine, and we'll hopefully you'll be able to tell us a little bit more about yourself momentarily. I just want, for all of those counting at home, I am significantly outnumbered. And this is something that Brennan never called attention to when we were studying the New Testament. And that's just because he's a better person than me. But we are in the, we've moved away from the appendix, as my Old Testament friends call it. And we are now in the Old Testament, and one of the more important and challenging and complex books probably in the Old Testament. So, Brennan, do you want to share just a little bit about what we're doing with this office hours, and in particular with the book of Job?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And I just want to say thank you again to Christine Yoder for joining us. Christine and I teach Old Testament together at Columbia Theological Seminary, along with Bill Brown, another treasured colleague. And I have been so deeply formed as a teacher and as a researcher and as a thinker by Christine's wonderful mentorship and help. So I just want to say a public thank you to Christine for being the best colleague I could ever imagine. But also I want to say thank you to Christine Yoder for creating such amazing scholarship about wisdom literature in general. So just a real quick overview, but so she's written a bunch of different articles and so on, but her book on woman wisdom and also the woman of substance in Proverbs 31, the woman of valor. It's an amazing book, a very detailed book that grew out of a dissertation. So for those scholars among us, but if you are looking for a quick, accessible, very well written and concise introduction to the book of Proverbs and a commentary on Proverbs. Her commentary in the Abingdon Old Testament series, the commentary series on Proverbs, is amazing. It is so well written. It is so accessible. So please, if I'm going to recommend one thing for the average Christian to take away today, it's please read Christine Roy Yoder on Proverbs, and maybe listen to us about Job. So in any event, but the book of Job, I think, is a really important book in general. It's, I think, the most theologically complex and perhaps, depending on what you think about it, profound book in the Old Testament. It is one of the world's most interesting and profound pieces of poetry. It is written in an incredibly complex and provocative style. It is theologically groundbreaking. There's a lot of biblical scholars who would say that it kind of pushes the theology of monotheism, the theology of what we call theodicy, or really like it's kind of a complicated way to say the problem of evil, but also just questions about justice in general and divine justice and human suffering, questions about why we worship God. I mean, all of these big questions the book of Job really brings up and then deals with in these very complex and complicated ways. So it's a fascinating book, but also recommends itself in times of crisis and turmoil. I saw a tweet the other day where someone said 2020 equals 1918 plus 1929 plus 1968. That is to say, the Spanish flu or the influenza, a massive pandemic, plus a stock market crash like 1929, plus a massive social uprising that just like in 1968. And all those things are happening within the span of a few months. So we are undergoing really a traumatic period in the global community and in our individual lives at the national level in the United States. Obviously, we've in the past week even come into a new era. I feel like things are just about to change in some way, but I don't know how. So, there's this tremendous uncertainty to what's happening today. And in that period of uncertainty and crisis, people turn to literature and theological reflection that has thought about these big transformations or perhaps crises. And the book of Job, I think, has some pretty important and interesting things to say. Also things that I think are often easy to miss. It's a subtle book. And so I think it really rewards prolonged reflection. And it really is one of those books that deeply rewards asking scholars what they have to say and looking at people and reading work from people who have done work in the ancient languages. Jerome, the translator of the Vulgate, translating for the first time in the Christian community from Hebrew into Latin. Although Macrina probably did a lot of the translation work that Jerome gets credit for, but in any event, in its introduction to Job, right around the year 400, Jerome said that the book of Job was amazingly beautiful and profound, but also translating it was like trying to catch an eel. It keeps slipping through your hands. So I felt like this is an important book for people to think about in these days, but also an important book for us to try to talk about what scholars and try to read what scholars have said about it. But in any event, I actually, right before we came live, Christine was sharing some thoughts about something that she had seen about that would basically answer a bit of the question of why Job in a time of unbelievable turmoil and crisis. And Christine, would you mind sharing those thoughts with us?
Sure. I'm first of all, let me just say how grateful I am to be here and to both of you for this opportunity. I just think this is a remarkable offering, and I'm delighted to be part of it. The timeliness of Job in these days, both of pandemic and the events of the past around and the breakdown, the violence, what we're seeing play out on the news. I was commenting to Brennan and Chris that I had seen the very potent and poignant appeal by the mayor of Atlanta, where all three of us are, for people to go home the night of the rioting. I guess it was 2 nights ago. And her starting point was one of parenthood. I'm a mother, and I come to this with deep passion and pain. And that her words, if you haven't seen them, I commend them to you. I then saw juxtaposed just by accident. I was kind of flipping around through YouTube and came upon some reflections by Trevor Noah, who was, they sort of captured him in a tight frame. And he really was pondering what he was seeing and his reflections on it. And his observation that we were bantering around before we started was this sense that the social contract that African Americans have pledged themselves to participate in, live by, has been so publicly, repeatedly, certainly, violated, that these protests are eruptions in the wake of, it's not possible to trust the contract any longer. If it ever was, it's not possible to trust the contract. And so the eruptions we're seeing is this, are ways of pressing up and against. So part of the connections to Job, of course, are ways in which structures, religious moral structures, may be fracturing, and ways in which Job is protesting claims about who God is, how God is, and how his experience, his suffering should be interpreted. So the fact that the book of Job holds us in a lament and in this disputational dialogue for as long as it does, I think in many ways mirrors this kind of persistence that the contract doesn't hold. This is not a faithful witness. What you're telling me, my friends, is not a faithful witness to what I am experiencing in the world and what my community is experiencing in the case of our present context. So that was, it was sort of an idle connection I was making with Brennan and Chris, but I do think it was helpful for me to see those two ways of naming the moment juxtaposed.
Well, and I speaking sort of just broadly about Job, and as I was reading some of the material last night, I was thinking that there are readings of Job that sort of tie it up with a nice, pretty bow, and how so much of Christian theology, right, wants everything to be neat and ordered and explainable and rational, even predictable, perhaps. And the more that I've sort of read Job with the assistance of other scholars, I've been challenged to think of it as maybe it doesn't actually tie anything up with a nice bow. And maybe it opens, it not only reflects some deep fissures in religion and in theology, but it also opens some up, even in its being written. And so, we started this study because of COVID, and COVID continues, and yet there's more turmoil and more upheaval. It only suggests that Job is just such a good way for us forward. And so glad that we're here in doing this.
Yeah, and we usually begin by asking our guests if there are any theological presuppositions or hermeneutical assumptions or anything like that they bring to the text that they would like to share. So, Christine, are there any insights you'd like to share with us before we jump in? Just kind of general thoughts about reading the Bible.
Sure. I appreciate the framing of this as sort of as theological presuppositions, because when I first saw that question, I started brainstorming. It's always good to remind yourself what are the guides that you use, how is it you think of yourself as an interpreter. And the first question would be, of course, why these texts? Why these particular texts? And of course, theologically, there's this confession that these are the texts, these are the words that we affirm and confess are inspired testimony about who God is, about God's work in the world, and about God's work in the life of God's people. So these are texts that have been claimed and reclaimed and confessed as life-giving for the people of faith. And so that's why we read these particular texts and we claim them as quite familiar. But even as they are familiar, it brings me to my kind of second observation of what drives me as an interpreter. It's always important, as we talk about in our classroom, Brennan, and Chris, I know you do this as well, to always keep in mind that these texts are also stranger. They are other to us. They are the products of communities and cultures very different from our own North American ones, certainly. They come from a different time, they come from a different region of the world, they come from different language groups, and they certainly come from different worldviews. And my hope always as an interpreter is that just recognizing that inspires in us humility on the one hand, and at the same time a hunger and curiosity to know about context. To think about how these texts animated and spoke into the particular communities and moments in time when they were coming together. So I think both the familiarity of Scripture, these are the texts that orient us, claim us, identify us, and give us future and hope. It's also, these are texts that we need to treat as though we're greeting a stranger with the kind of graciousness and humility that comes from really listening and attending to someone you don't know as well as you might. Which brings me to my sort of third reflection about theological presuppositions, and that is that Scripture is a site of encounter, of life-giving encounter, of life-challenging encounter, and certainly of life-transforming encounter. And it is the encounter between reader and readers and the text where the Spirit is at work that is the place where meaning and understanding happens. I appreciated Beverly Gaventa's comment, I guess a couple of weeks ago, about the text is never the same text because the reader, even the individual reader, keeps changing, right? I never sit down to the same text with the same sets of questions, even as I bring, as all the ones I've heard of your guests have underscored, how critically important it is to know who you are as an interpreter. The questions, presuppositions, values, history, background, the communities that have formed you, all of that comes to bear. But you don't sit down the same way, even in the same day, to the same text. The medieval rabbis talk about Scripture as like a fine spice. that sort of yields different flavors at different tastings. And that kind of sense of the depth and dimensionality of Scripture, I think, is critically important. Last thing, just to echo Eric Barreto, I realized as I was listening to him that I really do also think that even as we are mindful of ourselves as interpreters and this dynamic engagement with Scripture where meaning isn't fixed or static, but it's something that yields as the interpreter engages it, that it's imperative for me to read not only in community, but with others who don't read the same way you do. So yes, we read in communities of faith. Yes, and I hope we will also be very cognizant of reading with people who see the world, engage the world, reflect on the world in ways that are vastly different than how we do. So that's a few places to start.
Thank you for those rich insights. And that's one of the things I really love about co-teaching the introduction course with Christine Yoder, seeing the way that she lives that out as a way of teaching over the course of the year. So thank you so much. And one of the things that we also are committed to is the idea that the text is an ancient text written by ancient people who had their own particular language and culture and ideas. And if God's going to speak in some way to us through this text, it will also be kind of via these real ancient people who had real ideas and concepts and so on. So reading within that ancient context is important, but also that we aren't constrained by that ancient context, that it's a living text that continues to speak to us in new ways too. But it always kind of helps to take that little detour into the ancient world. And so just to kind of get us on the same page about Job, just kind of as a brief little overview, I mean, at least when we begin to teach Job in our course, we just start by saying, look, we don't really know who wrote Job. Church and tradition and the tradition of the rabbis would say, at least many of the rabbis, not all, in the Talmud say that Moses was in some way responsible for the book of Job, probably because it was like written in it seems like an ancient time, like a long ago, far away kind of thing. It also mentions Job sacrificing, and he's not a priest. So like, when was that okay? Like before Sinai was given. So like then okay, Moses probably had to write it then. But there's no claim in the book that Moses writes this anywhere, right? It's just a completely anonymous all throughout, like most ancient literature is, right? But one of the things in reviewing for this that I found really interesting is that several scholars, Chunyoung Seao does a great job of kind of summarizing this, but have pointed out that it has a lot of resonances with the time of the exile, or even beyond, maybe the Persian period, which Professor Yoder has focused on in some of her research. But there's some clues about kind of certain words that are used here and there, but also perhaps this reference to raiding Chaldeans in chapter 1, which only the time Chaldeans come raiding anywhere near Israel is sometime in the exile, like at the time of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. So maybe that has to be, but also the themes, that when would someone ask these big, important questions about God and feel the freedom to be so angry as we find in the dialogues with Job. So maybe those kind of figure in some way, but really I think more important than asking where and when it was written is probably this question of like genre. Like, what kind of thing are we reading when we read Job? And I don't know if you all had kind of thoughts or any insights about like what did you all, how does that shape the way you all think about Job?
I'm happy to go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Or jump in. So I really appreciate your reflections about, provenance. Where does this text come from? Who, likely, when, and how? And the situating of the text somewhere in the late exilic or early post-exilic, as people are reflecting back on the trauma of exile, I think is a really helpful way of thinking about the coming together of this book. And the question of genre is complicated with regard to Job, of course. We certainly think of Job as a wisdom text. That is a text that would be grouped in with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, with Ben Sira or Sirach and Wisdom of Solomon and the Apocrypha. So we do think of it within a category of literature that is that holds those texts in conversation. Even as we do that, though, we recognize, I mean, you're holding Ecclesiastes and Proverbs in the same group, right? There's this kind of sense in which the basket is quite large and holds a pretty complex diversity of texts. So if you think about, so wisdom text, let me just say a quick word about the genre or category.
Yeah.
So wisdom texts are largely concerned with a question about what is good for the human, sort of how is it one navigates personally, morally, socially, religiously, for the sake of human flourishing and ultimately the flourishing of the world. So it's asking questions of character and of moral formation and ways in which both the individual, the family, the neighborhood, and the community might thrive. And it's speaking to those kinds of questions out of experience. It's pointing to, Brennan uses the example in class, which I like so much, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this bit of wisdom. This is proven true 4 out of 5 times. So there's a sense of garnering human experience for the sake of speaking into a moment and orienting people in life. And Job is participating in that, certainly. And within Job, we see a host of genres in play. This is true elsewhere in wisdom literature, certainly. But Job seems to, as Carol Newsom, who I know will be on next week, tip to self, always precede Carol, don't follow Carol. Carol has really done remarkable work, which I'm sure she'll speak to, exploring the genres that are in play in the book of Job, and how genres as forms of speech are pressing certain kinds of questions. They're asking for certain kinds of answers. They're constructing a world according to certain rules. And so knowing the genre gives you access to what kind of truth or what kind of claim is most important. And what Job does, that Carol very helpfully has described in book length, is juxtapose genres in such a way, to Chris's observation, there isn't a final resolution, but rather there's both an intentional engagement of different genres towards different truth claims, and a sense of unsettled, not resolved tension that stays with the reader long after the book concludes. So you have a folk tale at the beginning, you have laments, you have different kinds of traditions that are put into play, you have proverbs, you have a host of different genres that are in dynamic, conversive relationship without resolution.
Yeah, that idea of dialogue that kind of continues throughout the book. That the center of the book is this kind of wisdom dialogue, which other ancient people, Mesopotamians did and Egyptians did. They had these dialogues where they would think through ideas together using characters, kind of like, I don't know, Brothers Karamazov or something. Like these different characters talk and try to come up with some idea of the truth of the world or whatever through their conversation. Socrates and but what's interesting too is to see that Carol's argument that the different parts of the book of Job are actually creating a dialogue themselves. That when I read that for the first time, that just flipped me over in my chair. I couldn't understand what she was saying at first, and then I thought, wow, that's a brilliant insight. But thank you so much for definitely taking us through that really complicated point about how genres have different truth claims or different ways of seeing the world. Yeah, and Chris, did you have like any other anything pop out at you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing, and I communicated this a little last night with y'all in our planning document. I've been teaching on the resurrection on Thursday nights at First Press, and I know that Job is not anywhere close to apocalyptic literature, and yet I've been thinking a lot about how the resurrection idea is birthed out of a breakdown of a social contract, a social religious contract that says, good people get good things in their life and bad people get bad things in their life. And that what we see in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, or other reflections on the resurrection is a desire to maintain God's power, maintain God's justice, even when the world seems completely upside down. And when I've been teaching that class, I've used the language of normal wisdom. That this idea that this is the dentists recommend, Brennan. That normal wisdom says generally, if you follow the Torah, if you are obedient and if you're faithful, good things will happen. And that the reflection on the resurrection comes because that recommendation doesn't work, and the people are being slaughtered because of their faithfulness, because of their obedience. And so asking that question of where is God in the midst. And so I'm so happy to sort of be studying Job alongside of that study on the resurrection, because again, I think for me, there's just some really interesting resonances among these texts, and really, how do you respond when social and religious contracts break down?
To me, oh, sorry.
No, that's all I was going to say.
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking about how, typically the world has a sense of order to it, right? I mean, for many people across time and space, ancient people and modern people, most of the time, or maybe not most, but some of the time, it seems like the world has an order and logic to it. Good things happen if you work hard, et cetera. And then sometimes that works. But and that's where a lot of wisdom literature focuses on the most of the time. But there are these exceptions. And it seems like Job pushes these exceptions to the limit to say the exceptions are important too. And one interesting thing that I was reflecting on last night is or at least interesting to me, but is that in Job, whenever you think about normal, right? This is normal. It's normal for people who work hard to get rewarded. It's abnormal, and whenever people start to ask questions about normal, you kind of get into, well, who says it's normal? Or, what creates normal, right? The norming, right? There's kind of a way of seeing the world that has power, can shape people, right? A normal way for a man to act, right? Or normal, normal. It's normal for a man to be in power, something like this, right? These kind of constructions of gender and identity and race, all these different constructions that create norms and then kind of police them in a way, right? And Job seems to say, hey, the exceptions are actually important too, and you can actually do really interesting theology and important theology by looking at these things that don't fit into the norms or the normal, right? And it seems to me like we're looking at that right now, in our country in so many ways. We're in so many different kind of exceptional states right now. Financially, in terms of police brutality, and in terms of the way Americans are starting to address race in more concrete ways, in terms of epidemiology, right? We're in all these different states of exception. So that kind of focusing on the exception, and I know we'll get into this later on. The chapters 1 and 2 are not about the protesting Job, right? So that's the patient Job. But when we get to chapter 3, we start to see this kind of radical protest based on the exception and exceptions to the norm. And so I think that's part of the reason why I think this is going to be so interesting for us to kind of follow this through, but also how it does push back a little bit at some of the different kind of genre conventions of the ancient world and of ancient Israel. What's a normal wisdom text? Or what's a normal way to talk about God, right? Carol Newsom has pointed out that Job chapter 9, verse 22 has the most heretical thing that any ancient thinker has ever said. Not just in Israel, but that she couldn't find any religious statement in the ancient world that was as radical as Job 9:22. We'll get to that next week, of course. But anyway, I thought that was an important thought.
An entire hour in and of itself.
Yes. So thank you for helping us think about the genre or the type of literature, this wisdom literature, some of the assumptions of that. But maybe we can just jump into the text. And this is one of my favorite things to point out about Job. And of course, this is an ancient insight, ancient all the way to anonymous rabbis in the Talmud, who pointed out that the beginning of Job is actually a really interesting grammatical construction in Hebrew. And it tells us something also of a genre or a type of literature. And to me, this is a crucial thing for understanding the whole rest of the book. But I know that Alan Cooper, in one of the readings that we put out there, he mentions this too. But this beginning, in the NRSV, there was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And I love how that puts him in this land Uz, which is kind of far away, but where is it? We don't know. It's mentioned a couple times in the Bible. It's a desert place or something, but we don't know. It's a far away, once long ago in a galaxy far, far away. It kind of is this, right? But also, it begins with the two Hebrew words, ish hayah, a man there was. And this is actually an unusual way to start a Hebrew story.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, the first time that Chuleong Seao pointed this out when I was at Princeton Seminary, just blew me away. That he said, if you look at this grammatical construction, the only times in the Bible that this appears in Hebrew, they're all parables.
Mm.
So this is the way that Nathan talks to David in 1 Samuel chapter 12, where Nathan is telling David the story of hey, there's a guy who's got a lamb, and this one guy's got a big flock, and the guy with the big flock takes the one lamb, right? And then at the end of the story, he says, hey, that's you. It's a story about you, meant to convict you and make you think about yourself in a different way. And when Leon pointed that out, I just thought that was amazing. Like, it's at least it's suggested to be a parable. I don't know what you all think about that, or has that struck you as kind of an important issue or topic?
I agree. I think it's a really helpful way, right out of the gate, those first two words. Other narratives start with Haya, and it happened that. But this sort of reversal does, as we've been talking about, set an expectation for what it is the text is going to do. And I think that, compounded with the fact that who knows exactly where Uz is, right? It could be south of Edom, north of Arabia. So that's where we think it could be. There's reference to the Easterners, right? There's this sense that somewhere out there, but we don't know exactly. And Job, for all intents and purposes, doesn't appear to be Israelite either. So you have a text that opens in the first couple verses, the first verse, by identifying a kind of unknown place, a person who isn't necessarily Israelite, arguably not Israelite, and then you're being set into a genre or into a world that is didactic, that is like a parable, like a folk tale. So we're being cued to read, and this distancing of Job. Also, I think Carol and I'm sure Leon also speak about this. There's this sense in which that allows us to almost sit back and observe Job in his land from a distance, and treat him in some ways like a universalistic Adam or a paradigm of the kind of ideal, perfect, wise man. So it's setting up a kind of test case, a paradigm that will unravel fairly quickly.
Like an experiment.
I don't want to take us too aside, but I while we're here, there's a question on Facebook Live that I think is a good question, which is are there similar Job tales out there, and in the ways that we have similar flood stories, or even there's stories similar to Daniel, and in other ancient Near Eastern cultures? Are there other stories like Job in the ancient Near Eastern world?
Brendan, you started to talk about it. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, but I mean, I'll share a little bit, but you can come back and fill in too. But so there's comparisons to different parts of Job.
Okay.
But what we don't have is something where these different parts are all smushed together. So the dialogue part, where Job and his friends are arguing with each other, there's a different kind of dialogues between a sufferer and a friend, where the friend's trying to comfort the sufferer. What's unusual about Job is that they get really angry at each other and then they end angry. The other ancient dialogues end up usually finding some kind of common ground or middle ground. So that's one thing. But also you get this lamentation poetry where people are just crying out of how much in pain they are and how much they want their God to help. So like in Babylon, you have this kind of prayer of a sufferer, a righteous sufferer, where he's just asking God, please help, or his God, Marduk, the god of Babylon. But so you get that, which is kind of like Job 3 or other parts of Job. So you get these like little comparisons, or folk tales. The folk tale where, chapters 1 and 2 of Job, I mean, the point of chapters 1 and 2 by itself is kind of like, hey, just buck up and God will end up eventually blessing you. I mean, suffer bravely, which is kind of what Philippians says, right? And that's crucial for me to understand, is that like the different parts of Job argue with each other, and they're not all saying that the other one is always wrong. So there's something we need to kind of tease out over the next few weeks, I think, about what does it mean when we say, look, the book of Philippians says, rejoice in suffering. Job chapters 1 and 2 kind of say rejoice in suffering. But then chapter 3 says something different. And so is that not right? Is Philippians not right? Or is Job not right? Which part of the book is right or wrong? So that's what we don't find, I think, in the ancient world, is this very complex combination of different genres that really require us to ask questions of the literature itself. I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah, I would echo. I just think that's really, you had made, the reason I nudged over to you is that you had made mention of this, the kind of disputational literature discourse that we find elsewhere. But the combination, I think, of the prose narrative, prologue and epilogue, and then the mix in the middle really is an exceptional piece of literature in the ancient world.
Yeah, great. So let's, as we continue to sort of dig into the first, 5 or so verses, what should we make of sort of this character of Job, Job's behavior, Job's possessions, Job's life, and even his, one of the things that we read about was his anxiety about his kids. And so let's just, what are we looking for in these first 5 verses? How is the story being set up? How is this parable being set up? And what's important for us to attend to, do you guys think?
Well, I think these opening verses in some ways are have all the catchphrases, have all the hallmarks of what would have been regarded in the ancient world, and certainly a proverbial world, one that was informed by wisdom, as the exceptional life. This is the best expression of what it is to be a wise person. And it's so crafted, that this is such crafted narrative, crafted speech, that you have this sort of fourfold description. He's blameless and just, he's a fear of the Lord and an avoider of evil. There's 4 descriptions of him, all of which are language coming deeply steeped out of Proverbs and other wisdom texts. So he's being identified by the narrator, and then of course later by God, as bearing these hallmarks of the wise, moral, upright, just person. In fact, I think he's the only character that is venerated in such a way, the only character that gets celebrated with this kind of heaping on of descriptors. That then is followed by a 4-fold description of his wealth, his life, his property, his family. And so you have this kind of 4 being a symbol of completeness or perfection, that he really is the epitome of all that would be desired in terms of the wise person. And as in commentators, including Carol and Leong have noted too, of course, there's a question about how to read the relationship between the description of Job and his life. So we have, this is a sticky thing we tell our students, in Hebrew, one letter, a vav, can serve both as a conjunction or a disjunction. So it can mean and or but. The very first word or letter of you can be read as a simple conjunction. He is all these things, and he has all this stuff and this kind of family and this kind of wealth. Or it can be read as, and so he has all of this, which might suggest then that all of his wealth, his family's well-being, his servants, all of these aspects of his life are blessings that he has received as a result of his upright moral character. So there's some ambiguity in the very beginning about the relationship between the attributes and the reward, the blessing, that I think it's going to persist. It's going to it sets a question that we're going to continue to play with as we get further into the book.
I fear that this reference will be not received by everyone viewing, but there's a song by Chance the Rapper called Blessings, and one of the choruses, the refrain is, the praises go up and the blessings come down. And this is, in some ways, the parable of Job sets that up, that Job, it seems like, has has lived a good life. The praises have gone up and the blessings have come down. And he's sort of, at least the opening of Job sort of sets that up, that his privilege, his possessions, his power, these are all a product of, we might say, his religiosity or his faithfulness or his goodness. Yeah. He has passed the Proverbs wisdom, exam, and has come back with flying colors. His teeth look great for the dentist's recommendations, and we are gonna see maybe that gets challenged.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is like one of the things that, again, when Leong Seao pointed this out when I was in class, this made my head explode. But he points out, yeah, okay, he's living the perfect life. Maybe that's related to him having all the perfect stuff. The perfect Christian has the perfect life. Which one causes which, right? Or are they related? We don't know, right? But so that question gets brought up. But then also this comment in verse 5. So yeah. Job's family is living in perfect harmony and so on. So Job's family loves each other. They're all partying in each other's houses all the time. They seem to be great kids, and everyone's having a fun time. And so what does Job do? He wakes up early every single morning and sacrifices compulsively just in case, not because they did anything bad, but because maybe they did something bad in their hearts. And just that, like, he does that it's what Job always did, it says.
Yeah.
So he's got this perfect life. He worships God perfectly. And then also, he's consumed with anxiety, like every moment of his life, and he's compulsively sacrificing just to get rid of any possible sin. And, to point out, does this sound like a good life? Or, asking us to think about these questions between maybe blessings and curses, which of course also come up in that statement, right? So that it may be that my children, this is in verse 5, it may be, Job says, that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. But what do we know about that word curse there?
Yeah. So let's put a disclaimer here, which is we're about to go deep down a rabbit hole of translation theory of Hebrew, but it's really, really important. Christine, would you tell us about what's going on with this cursing in verse 5, and why is that significant to a lay reader who doesn't know Hebrew or translation theory?
It's a great question. I have one brief observation to make, though, before we get into the whole blessing, this play with blessing and curse. I do think you can certainly read Job's kind of obsessive compulsive. I mean, I've often, when I've taught this text, talked about him as sort of a type A personality, right? He is constantly trying to just absolutely make sure everything is perfect, to the point where he's, even when all signs are, things are good, he is still off making these sacrifices, for the sake of his children. And part of me reads that we sort of tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of it's a sort of parody of just how extreme he is religiously. And at the same time, I have empathy for him in the sense that his life is so good, right? By all the standards by which he would have been brought up to measure his life. There seems, for me at least, there seems to be a hint that he gets just how fragile it could be, right? That it's not a given, that there is a fragility to it, that it could be compromised. And so he's going above and beyond in hopes of preserving what he understands to be a good life. And I have empathy for that, the kind of ways in which we want to protect. When we know we have it good, sometimes we act in ways that some others would call obsessive, when we're really trying to protect what we recognize as a good life. But the blessing curse thing, oh my gosh, I see our time. So the term barak can be used both for blessing and curse, but it's not used for cursing really elsewhere. There is a sense in which this is a euphemism, right? This is a word that's being used like 7 times in the prologue, and at each time, one has to determine, the interpreter has to determine whether to read it as bless or curse. So it's an interpretive move. The idea of the euphemism is that the narrator, not the translator, the narrator is playing with this in that you wouldn't want to curse God, right? To say kalal, for example, in Hebrew, kalal Adonai, would be problematic. You don't want to put cursing, it'd be abhorrent. It would be something that no one would want to juxtapose that verb with that object. And so the narrator is playing with that and inviting readers to have to make a decision at each juncture. What's being said? Is it blessing or is it cursing? And this becomes, it grows, of course, in intensity to where we may not get there today, but to where Job's wife, right, it says curse or bless God and die, and it opens up a whole new way of thinking about what is she actually saying. It's an ambiguity that prompts reflection.
Yeah. So the idea is that every time this word that's translated, and there's no note for it in the NRSV, which is bizarre to me. But the word, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. It does, like the literal word is, if you go to the dictionary, look, it's Barak, like Barack Obama. It's to bless. Yeah. And it almost always means to bless, except for maybe in like these 7 times in Job where it maybe means curse. I mean, I think that's like that's a signal to me that the narrator's doing something tricky here. It looks like just a little folktale about a person who's supposed to like be, confident about God in the face of suffering, but instead it's like there might be something going on here, right? Because are blessings curses or are curses blessings? I mean, it seems to kind of make us ask these deep questions, like the relationship between Job's behavior and his outcomes in life, right? Does he?
You get it right at verse 5, right? So the stumbling block presents itself right out of the gate. So you see modern translations like the NRSV and others making the decision as translators to read Barak as curse, because it makes no sense to say he would offer sacrifices. If they were blessing God in their hearts, that makes no sense whatsoever. So the very first occurrence of this verb prompts the interpretive move that the narrator seems to be inviting us to play with, that prompts this. All of a sudden Barak can mean to curse.
And it actually dovetails with what God is kind of worried about, which seems to be Job, right? Is this guy good or not? Or we don't know, right? And just like Job is worrying about what's in his kids' hearts when he can't really tell, God seems to be worrying about what's in Job's heart and seems to be worrying in some way about the relationship between the blessings and curses, right? Does Job just bless God because Job's got blessings? Maybe they're a curse then. Those blessings that Job has, maybe they kind of force him to bless God. And is that a curse actually if you don't, right? So it gets us into all these kind of theological problems here.
Exactly.
But in any event, yeah. So Christine, would you mind just kind of laying, like chapter 1, you've pointed this out many times, but chapter 1 is kind of structured, and chapter 2 has a structure too. It's structured in a really interesting way. Would you mind just kind of giving us kind of the plot of chapter 1 in that structure that you pointed out?
Sure, yeah. So in addition to this, it's a highly balanced narrative. And what readers, I'm sure, have observed is we're really moving back and forth between the earthly realm, the world of Job and his family, and the heavenly realm. And what that, we go back and forth actually in quite balance. So you have, the daily, day after day after day, Job is doing this as the chapter opens, the verses we've just been talking about. And then we pivot with one day. It just so happens, as Job is going about all this, that one day there's this meeting of the heavenly council. This is an image, of course, of the divine council where sort of celestial representatives would meet with God. This is an ancient Near Eastern understanding. It's elsewhere in the Old Testament. But it's in this heavenly scene, this divine scene, that we have the figure of the Hasatan, and who is an adversarial-like figure, the one who contests and raises questions, and who in Job has this job of kind of wandering around, patrolling the earth and coming back to report on it. So we go back and forth between God and the Hasatan's engagement. We can talk about the Hasatan and the earthly realm. And what starts to happen, of course, is that as readers, we have access to both realms, right? We're watching both stories. Right. But Job and his family, and eventually Job's friends, don't have access to the celestial realm. And that provokes the kinds of questions that the prologue ultimately will leave us with, including whose integrity really is at stake in this book? Is it Job's or is it God's? What kind of God does this kind of bragging, has this kind of anxiety, does this kind of contest with the welfare of a believer? What kind of God would put that at risk? So we end up as readers torn between, well, actually, for me as a reader, far more interested in what do I do with a God who would do this, right, than the character of Job, which the narrator God have affirmed as being blameless and upright. So the friends think it's his integrity. Readers realize a much more complicated world that has greeted them in the prologue. Yeah. So it's this really expertly crafted back and forth human realm, divine realm that sets up a deep tension.
Yeah. And just a basic question, and I think probably a short answer is in order. But when we read in the NRSV and Satan in verse 6, we shouldn't imagine, a red beast with a tail and horns and a pitchfork, right? This isn't the notion of Satan that gets developed in later Jewish and Christian texts, right? This is something else.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah, this is the Ha-Satan, Ha being the definite article, the in Hebrew. So this is we see the Ha-Satan referred to also in the book of Zechariah in chapter 3, where the Ha-Satan is sort of the one whose role we often talk about as the devil's advocate, or the, not to associate it later with the fiery figure, pitchfork and all that. But this is really the one whose role it is to oppose or to ask or to be adversarial. And it's only later that the notion of the Satan, in the way that you've just characterized it, develops. So this is an early expression of kind of a member of the divine council. Some have also talked about, I think both Carol and Leon talk about this too, that in some ways the adversary figure, the Ha-Satan, functions as a kind of personification of divine doubt. So where God is certain, right? Job is upright and blameless. If there's any doubt, it gets articulated by the Ha-Satan figure. So both here and in Zechariah, there's a sense in which the adversary, the Ha-Satan, is the one who is giving voice to any hesitation God might have about the character of, in the case of Zechariah, the high priest, and in the case of Job.
So I love too how the one other place the Ha-Satan character shows up in the Old Testament is in Numbers. It's the thing that it's God's angel that is waving the sword at Balaam. And when the donkey speaks in Numbers, that's the Ha-Satan is waving the sword. So that's not Satan. And I think it's super important for the theology of Job that we move away from how most Christians have understood it. There was a question in the comments to say, is Job dualistic? And I think it's really important that we see it's not, that this is not Satan. And I'm not saying that just because, I don't know, I want to wreck people's theology. The idea of Satan develops over a long period of time. But in the book of Job, if this is a contest between Satan and God, and that Job has to pick God's side or something and fight against Satan, then why does Satan not appear in the rest of the book, including the end? Like, the God's speeches don't say, hey, look, here's how the world works. I'm fighting against an evil force, and you got to resist the evil force. Like, that's not even a part of the story at all. And it's kind of it's like an easy way out for us to be like, oh, that's the devil, that's evil incarnate. And that's what's causing all of Job's stuff, because also God's the one who does all the bad stuff to Job, right? God claims it. Like, I did this in chapter 2. God's like, why did I do this stuff? Right. So that to me is like, if we take the kind of easy way out of saying, it's just the devil, and then it's the devil versus God, then it allows us to kind of walk by or step around a lot of the theological problems that this book, I think, is designed to raise, right? For me, if we set aside the question of the presence of evil or evil that is somehow outside of God or outside of God's power, I think we miss the bigger problem, which is that Job is asking the question, what if God does bad stuff? right? Like, what if God actually does things that we don't like or hurt us? What do we do then, right? And I think today, like, we can ask that question, looking at like the way that, for many of us, our government or our structures of power kind of embody something of like divine power for us on earth, right? The king and the sovereign. And, when we look at like the police forces of the United States of America, we kind of trust, well, there is not, in many places, not trust, but there's an implicit kind of desire, right, to trust these forces of power, that they're going to do right for us in the end, or maybe it's just a couple bad apples or something. I've heard that said sometimes, but to see kind of systems become corrupted forces us to ask these bigger, I think, more important kind of questions, which is, I think, at least where Job is leading us to.
Yeah, and that's in some ways the connection I was trying to make with the Trevor Noah observation, that that this is the unraveling of the system that's supposed to actually be working on behalf of Job, right? Job has played the game, so to speak, and Job has accomplished what would be the hallmarks of wisdom, and that system is now compromised by the very persons in power, in a game, in a bet. So it's a radical unraveling of his world, which I know as we go, we've follow this. There's two of these wagers, that first of all, take everything away from him, and secondly, of course, do everything to him, but kill him, so affect him with a skin disease, ultimately, is what he receives. But I actually found, I was commenting to you both last night in thinking about chapter 1 as part of the sort of setting of this, the prologue, 1:13-22, the description of the unraveling of Job's world, to me, in this particular pandemic context, was really striking. I've always been kind of overwhelmed by this, because there is a sense, this sort of refrain of, I alone have escaped to tell you. I alone have escaped to tell you. The one witness to the destruction in reverse order of Job's world, right? It takes all the characteristics of his life and it unravels them in backward order to where ultimately his children the young ones are destroyed in the last. But it's the combination of human forces, raiders, these Chaldeans and Sabaeans, and cosmic forces, a fire and a great wind. It seems that both heaven and earth are acting to strip away all that has defined and given life to who Job is. So it's a dismantling of the system and his world, both in a chaotic storm-like way and by the actions of human predators and marauders and violence seekers. So it's a pretty overwhelming destruction of the world, where at the end, it's all Job can do is fall to the ground, as he does, and lament, and prone himself, he worships. So it's his only reaction can be this sort of ritual act of despair and lament.
And it seems like the kind of stripping away of his life to see if he will, that is the wager, right?
That's it.
The Satan figure. And somebody asked why is it that it's written Satan in the NRSV? It's because they didn't want to upset people. Sorry. I mean, but everyone working for the NRSV project, when they translated it, they all knew that was not right, but they did it because people would get upset. Sorry. But anyway, but this, yes. Oh boy. But in any event, but this is the Satan figure, this kind of divine district attorney or something. Asks, does Job fear God for nothing? And that word, I think, is so important. That chinam. Right? Mm-hmm. For no reason or no purpose. It can mean both. Isn't there a reason Job worships you, or doesn't Job worship you because he wants to get something out of you, right? And that question, Davis Hankins has pointed out in his monograph, that just how radical a question that is, that we can't find evidence that question was ever asked before Job, and not in just in Israelite literature, but in Mesopotamian literature or Egyptian literature. Like, why do we work? Is it possible to worship without wanting to get something out of the relationship with God? That seems to have been like a, world-shattering question, right? Would we worship if everything was taken? And in the ancient world, I think people would just have said, no, you wouldn't worship a God who's a loser God who can't get you what you want, right? Absolutely not, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a contract between you and God.
Contract, right? The contract that Deuteronomy, the Torah lays out quite clearly and repeatedly and wisdom literature lays out, if you do all this, then you shall receive these blessings, right? It's always recognized, I think, as a contract that we can see the gray. You know, you look around at the world, you see the gray. You see the contract doesn't hold up in a very strict way, but it is the contract. And I think you're exactly right. The Hasatan is pressing the question of, if the contract's not there, if the contract proves unreliable, would Job still worship you? I think that's exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And that's like such a huge question, right? And like look like today, right? God's going to protect us, right? God's going to give us like Romans 12, right? God's going to give us like powers that are over us that are going to do the good for us, right? That we can trust in, right? Well, what if God breaks the contract? Like, what if God does evil? These kind of huge questions, right? Would you still worship, right? If you got nothing out of the deal and God only gave you bad? It's like. But this is a question that people I think have to be asking today. But anyway, this is I know we got time. Yeah.
I was just going to say, it strikes me that this question sort of gets at the heart of many cultural despisers of Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. That propose that religion is a crutch, that religion is the opiate, right? And the adversary's question here sort of cuts to the heart of that. What if religion isn't about, causality and predictability? One of the extra readings talked about, in the religious world of antiquity, this idea that the causality and predictability of blessings and curses, that this question sort of raises that and just goes right to the heart. What if there is no order to that? What if there is no predictability, no causality? If we're wrestling with experience and our experience of both blessings and curses, or what we interpret as blessings and curses, and if there isn't this contract, and what would it look like to be a religious people? What would it look like to worship God without that contract? And just again, it's a very destabilizing question.
That's a good word.
Yeah. And like any good parable, like we might be like, well, what's going on in Job's heart? Is Job going to do this? And really the ultimate question, as Liang Sao points out, is what's actually in our heart? It's trying to get us to think about ourselves, just like Nathan's parable is trying to get David to think about himself. And instead of that big question of why do bad things happen to good people, we know why this happened to Job. Right, because God decided to do this crazy thing, like to test him when so all to say, like the question of the prologue really seems to be different than the question that Job raises in the dialogues. Like there's different questions in Job that each section raises, and the question here seems to be, why do we worship God, and would we worship in the absence of any discernible benefits that we could get from worship? Which is like kind of a huge question. But all to say that we're not going to wrap this part of the book up with a nice bow, because each part of Job gets kind of the question gets punted to the next section of the book. And as Carol Newsom points out, the question kind of gets posed, and then you take the book goes into a different genre, a different type of literature. So we're going to move into a wisdom dialogue, like almost like a philosophical conversation between Job and his friends. And we're going to approach that same question from a different perspective. At least that helps me to think about kind of the way it works. But also, one of the comments pointed out about this kind of structure and order, and questions of structure and order. And we often have this idea, and today we see this in the political discourse about the riots and the protests. It's like there's order and there's disorder. Right. And those are our two poles. That's all we got. But instead, I think the book of Job is trying to say maybe there's other types of order and disorder.
Right.
There's not just the order of like a police state, or the disorder of people, rioting. Right. No, there's all kinds of order and disorder and relationships that can be formed. And I think that's one of the fun things we'll be able to tease out. Sorry, I just kind of spilled a lot.
I really like that. I mean, I think the very order of the prologue mirrors the order of Job's life. And as that dismantles, to where he's sitting on a trash heap, scraping at his open sores with a potsherd, you see the genre shift. because the genre can no longer contain or adequately describe in any way what is Job's experience, Job's suffering, Job's pain. You can no longer stay in the same genre when it has completely dismantled around you.
Wow. Yeah, you kind of need to find other forms of
find
speech
another
and thought.
vehicle, right? You got to find another
huge.
vehicle.
And just to wrap this up too, in a way, we think about wisdom literature being not mainly about giving you answers or giving people answers, but about helping people to grow into being better thinkers and to respond to their own. It's not a manual. Like Proverbs isn't a manual to how to live your life. It's a bunch of different competing thoughts and claims that are trying to help you become a better person and a person who becomes wise. And so if we think about how ambiguous and kind of these big questions that this seemingly simple folktale are really asking, and these things that they're bringing up. I mean, maybe part of the answer isn't really to come up with one solution, but for us to ponder this, the way that human life is, and that this kind of state of exception or normalcy doesn't ever really exist for many of us or any of us ever. But this also leads me to I want to mention before we leave Job's wife, and that she, I think, plays this role of teaching us about this wrestling and struggling and thinking about these different points of view or perspectives or questions. And she's almost always read as this horrible character in Christian theology, that she's the devil's handmaiden and all this stuff. And many interpreters, Chuliang Xiao has a great article about this. But just this idea that Job's wife actually only says 6 words. 3 of them are a quotation from the Hasatan. 3 of them are a quotation from God.
Yeah.
Bless, she says bless God and die, which can be taken as kind of theological euthanasia, right? Is a quotation from the Satan. And you still persist in your integrity. That's basically a quotation from what God had said and the narrator said. Right. And so what she's doing, instead of saying like, I hate you, Job, die, she's really just saying these are the 2 sides of this equation, right? You are still persisting in your integrity. It's not a question in Hebrew. It's just you are still persisting in your integrity. Yeah. And then bless God and die. And those can be taken in it's like a Rorschach test for like what do you think? But in any event, I'll just say that to me, just we are left with this giant puzzle that has started to ask the deepest questions I think that we can kind of ask about ourselves. And so, Christine, can you just answer them for us really quickly? I wrap it up. Yeah.
I do think that Job is unique in some regards of how much it demands of the reader and just how much work we have to do, and how much it presses against a recipe book approach to scripture that is so common in certain circles, that that the Bible gives us a recipe for the good life, and actually it gives us, it invites us into an encounter, Christine, as you said, and into some really hard questions. And I think that, if we took all of the Bible, and thought of it through the lens of Job, it would encourage us to read quite differently. And even read with some questions and some engagement that are in some circles, discouraged. And so I want to hold up, that one of the perspectives that Job offers us as people of faith is to do that sort of active reading that Job demands, that maybe other parts of Scripture don't demand as naturally, but that we are invited, I think, by Job and the story to really wrestle with Scripture and to be left with this question of blessing, of good or bad, or the wife's question of you've got to make a decision, and how will you decide with this text or against this text?
I think that's great. It makes me think about, I know we're wrapping up, but it makes me think about Kathleen O'Connor, our colleague Kathleen O'Connor, has described the book of Job as a puzzle, where the pieces, even if you just are to lay out the pieces of the book, that just when you think you've kind of settled on maybe an understanding of one piece, a piece somewhere else in the book is going to pop up. It's not going to fit. It's not going to work. So it is a challenge. I mean, I think you're exactly right, Chris, that this book requires a kind of attentiveness and a willingness to hold disjunction and lack of harmony and debate, within the reader's own self, and to try to kind of move between the vantage point of Job's life, Job's friends, the world. I mean, it requires a lot of the reader, and is instructive for books that are perhaps not quite so obviously a puzzle, but nonetheless, if we steep ourselves deeply in them, are going to challenge us and trouble the waters and give life and hope. So it's I think it's a really important interpretive enterprise to engage.
And maybe not fit nicely on a bumper sticker.
Right.
You know, if your theology can fit on a bumper sticker, maybe it's not adequate. And I'll just stop there.
But just one more quick little thing, but just, you know, how much like this moment this is, right? That we have many kind of easy answers, or there are many easy answers that many people offer, knee-jerk responses to crises and problems, but like we've entered into an age where like the exception has become the norm. And so we need to step into this uneasy space, I think theologically, but also politically, of asking these big questions and not knowing the answers to them, and trying to figure out how do we move forward here? And, you know, and that kind of theology from the state of exception, it just strikes me, I mean, how similar that is to the statement Black Lives Matter, which to me, the reason that all lives matter is not what the protesters are saying, but they're saying Black Lives Matter, because if you, blackness, you know, in the United States and kind of our white supremacist culture, you know, it is itself kind of rendered into the state of exception. So if you start thinking from that point, if you start thinking about ethics from the point that every Black life matters, you are going to cover white people like that, but it will start from this kind of theology or this ethical state of exception, and make that the norm. And then that's the way to kind of overturn everything. But it's a hard job for many people, and it's kind of hard to kind of pivot. And often crises are these times and places where people actually are forced to confront some of these problems, right? I mean, I'm just going to say that like in chapter 3 and beyond, when for the reading for next week, Job is trying to do theology from a state of exception, and his friends are trying to do theology the normal way. And I think that's kind of the problem. Not to say the friends are wrong necessarily, but
no, exactly. And I love the turn you just made. And I know we're signing off, but I really what I find really intriguing about the friends, among other things, is that they really are trying to bring the best of tradition to bear on a situation they do not understand. And in some ways, that's instructive for all of us, where we try to lean into our standard ways of responding in the face of violence or bigotry, or which we fall into patterns. And what this book is telling us is those patterns are false. They're false in the face of the very real suffering that Job is experiencing. The explanations the friends offer, as much as they love Job and as much as they seek to comfort and console him, do not recognize the reality that they are sitting in front of.
Right. Oh, man.
Wow, that's huge.
Okay, so we clearly could keep going, and we will keep going for 4 more weeks with other guest hosts, but Christine, I just want to say thank you so much for being with us, for sharing your wisdom on the wisdom literature and on the book of Job. And thanks so much to those of you who joined us on Facebook Live and who joined us on the Zoom webinar. Please continue to ask questions on the Office Hours Facebook page. Continue to send us notes. But thank you so much for the time, and we'll see you all next week for the second week of our study.